Hello, my name's Han Hockey, but my friends like to call me Han, so you can call me that too. And if in the past month or so you've opened Netflix or Hulu or most major streaming services, you might have come across a girl boss who flew a little too close to the sun. I did not come up with that saying, by the way. And said girl boss definitely ended up getting burnt to crisp severely, publicly too. From Anna Delvey's con in Inventing Anna, to Elizabeth Holmes' story of fraud in The Dropout that's streaming on Hulu, and finally to Sarma Mangilis' swindle on The Bad Vegan on Netflix. The most popular streaming services are dishing out the hottest and most publicly and true stories about women who are pretty much con men, con women, con people, con artists. And while I personally love to watch a show about both women's rights and women's wrongs, I can't help but wonder why we are seeing such a sudden influx of shows about women committing crimes, and mostly white-collar crimes at that too, specifically when these women were once either regarded as trailblazers, feminist icons, or just women really paving the way in an industry dominated by men. Do we love to see the girl boss fall, or perhaps a con woman fail? Or is it something a little more sinister than that? Join me as we explore. This sounds like I'm in the beginning of a Nat Geo show. And just to be completely clear, all of these women who I named above did commit crimes that they're being prosecuted for or have been prosecuted for. But I'm just trying to figure out why we're so interested in when women commit white-collar crimes, when white-collar crimes are committed by a lot of people. So before we begin to trace this out, let's take a look at what the girl boss phenomena is, where it came from, and why these women would be regarded as the girl bosses of the moment. We're going to talk about the world girl boss and also why the term ended up becoming the very thing it was supposedly speaking up against. The world girl boss was invented by Sophia Amoruso, who is the co-founder of Nasty Gal. I think there's even a Netflix show about her called Girlboss. It is literally called Girlboss, and it entered all of our dictionaries when Sophia Amoruso dropped her memoir called #Girlboss in 2014. And what's really interesting is that the very woman who coined the term Girlboss later shared a similar fate to the girl bosses we were talking about, since she was later hit with lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, accused of discrimination, abusive management, and even eventually the company going bankrupt, which by itself is also an interesting fact because Sophia Amoruso attributed the success of Nasty Gal to it being, and I will be quoting, an office full of girls and no one is bitchy. The one person who has permission to be bitchy is me, and I'm not. Which, retrospectively, yikes. Also, if you're wondering, she's no longer the CEO of Nasty Gal, or part of her other company called Girlboss Media. She just really likes that word. And now the #Girlboss ended up taking the industry by storm. According to Amanda Mull, a staff writer at The Atlantic, and I will be quoting, "Instead of dismantling the power men had long wielded in America, career women could simply take it for themselves at the office. Like Sheryl Sandberg's self-help hit, Lean In before it, Girlboss argued that the professional success of ambitious young women was a two birds, one stone type of activism. The pursuit of power could be rebranded as a righteous quest for equality, and the success of female executives and entrepreneurs would lift up the women below them. And this is why so many hardworking, ambitious young women gravitated towards the term girl boss. And the term became the defining word for the confident, camera-ready, hardworking young woman who's fighting to establish her very own in a field dominated mostly by men. She was the quintessential progressive feminist millennial dream. She was the woman building a name for herself and elevating all the other women around her against all odds. Girlboss was like the female personification of hustle culture. If you know, hustle culture was a lot more targeted towards women, or so we thought. A lot of the women that we collectively as a culture regarded as being the girl bosses ended up being exposed for being anything but. They had terrible workplaces, toxic work practices, discriminatory behavior, and even abusive at times, and also committed other severe crimes. The bosses of the industry like Sophia Amoruso, Mika Agarwal, Sheryl Sandberg, Yael Aflalo, and so many other women who were considered to be the physical equivalent of the word girl boss itself were stripped of their position, ended up resigning, or had to leave in the wake of these accusations coming to light. In particular, during late 2020, the news was rife with these explosive cases of the girl boss being exposed and how they weren't anything like they marketed themselves as. It was startling to see all these highly regarded women come stumbling and be knocked off their pedestal one after the other. And that's why the sudden influx of stories about women committing white-collar crimes is so similar to the news influx that exposed the falling of the girl boss leaders of the 2010s. In both cases, the women were regaled as emerging leaders, fighting for their own rights, and praised for destroying the patriarchal walls in an industry dominated by men. Some of the women I'm going to be mentioning in this video were also specifically part of the girl bosses being exposed in the late 2010s and 2020. And that's why I decided to use the term girl boss interchangeably with these con women, since I feel like a lot of them fit the mold of the girl boss or themselves were actually part of the group of girl boss leaders of the late 2010s. And so it's perfectly alright for me to say, if you girl boss too close to the sun, you might get a TV show out of it, because that's what ended up happening. And that's also what we're exploring. Why am I repeating the title of this video in this video? If you're still confused about what girl bosses mean, they're kind of like a way more successful version of those MLM girls who slide into your DMs being like, hey girly, do you want to be a hashtag girl boss? And then they pitch you a deal of your dreams that helped save them and help them become successful working women. All with the silent guarantee that it'll help you go bankrupt or drown under the weight of credit card debt. Anyway, moving along to the specific people that this video is actually about. What do you think of when you think of a con man or a criminal? Usually a suave, well-dressed, well-spoken man, no? Someone who very much would embody Michael Jackson's saying of, you've been struck by, you've been hit by, a smooth criminal. No? But it's usually never a woman, right? Well, if you worry that you share the same biases that I just mentioned, then don't worry. These women are bringing a touch of female representation to the once very male-dominated field of crime. Specifically, in the very male-dominated field of con artistry. Finally, feminism for everyone. So, who are these feminist leaders in question? 1. Anna Delvey. Anna Sorkin is a Russian-born German con artist and fraudster. Between 2013 and 2017, she pretended to be a wealthy German heiress under the name Anna Delvey. In 2017, she was arrested after defrauding or intentionally deceiving major financial institutions, banks, hotels, and acquaintances in US for a total of $275,000. In 2019, she was convicted in a New York State court of attempted grand larceny, larceny in the second degree, theft of service, and was sentenced to 4 to 12 years in prison. Netflix developed a television adaptation of how she committed this fraud and her story, titled as Inventing Anna, which was released in 2022. 2. Elizabeth Holmes. Elizabeth Holmes is an American former biotech entrepreneur who was convicted of criminal fraud. In 2003, she founded and was the CEO of Theranos, a now defunct health technology company that soared in valuation after the company claimed to have revolutionized blood testing by developing methods that could use surprisingly small volumes as a finger prick. By 2015, Forbes had named Holmes as the youngest and the wealthiest self-made female billionaire in America on the basis of a $9 billion valuation of her company. In the following year, as revelations of potential fraud about Theranos' claims began to surface, Forbes revised its estimate of Holmes' net worth to 0, and she was featured in its article on the world's 19 most disappointing leaders. Hulu developed a mini-series called The Dropout based on her story and the following legal repercussions of her actions. And 3. Sarma Mangalis. Sarah Mangalis is an American chef, cookbook author, and businesswoman. She was the owner and co-founder of Pure Food and Wine and One Lucky Duck, both vegan raw food restaurants in New York City. Both businesses closed in 2016 after staff walked out over unpaid wages. She was arrested for fraud in 2016 and convicted in 2017. In 2022, Netflix documentary series Bad Vegan, Fame, Fraud, and Fugitive details her scandal, including her relationship with Anthony Strangis and her financial crimes. So if you notice in common is all 3 of these women have streaming service shows. Why'd I go a little crazy over there? Now you may be wondering, well, these women are just con artists. What's so interesting about them to have warranted an entire video? And I say, what a great question, because that helps me to jump to the next part of this video. And that is, why these women in specific when other con artists exist? Or as I like to shorten it to, perhaps is there a double standard? Now the term girl boss in itself kind of feels infantilizing, no? These people are not girls, they're all women, because a girl is someone under the age of 18, because a girl is a child. And so why are we calling them girls? And beyond that, the term boss in itself isn't gendered, it's a gender neutral word. So then why do we need to be specific of girl boss? Because by doing that, aren't we gendering the word boss? And also aren't we making it then something that's more attributed to men than to women? I've never heard of the term hashtag boy boss existing. I just feel like having boss term specifically for women called girl, it kind of diminishes their authority, deny their agency, and just sort of pink washes the word, you know? But also along those lines, since I did previously mention that there are also a lot of con men, why are we so hyper-focused on the con woman? She can't be that much of a new concept, right? Now, The Take has an amazing video about the girl boss villain, which a lot of the women they have mentioned are similar to the girl bosses I have mentioned before, or have similar traits as them. A lot of them do kind of have this whole like, I'm empowering women, I'm a feminist sort of persona, when as like the story goes along, it is revealed that no, they're not. The only thing that they're empowering women is that they're empowering women to be criminals. That is a joke. Please do not quote me on that. A lot of these girl boss women are fake feminists, villains. They accrue wealth and capital power, and then they're punished for their crimes. According to The Take's video and research, they do a really good analysis and explanation of how these women do exactly that, which I encourage you to watch if you think that this video is interesting, or if you just want to know more about the topic I'm talking about in this specific section. So that video is going to be down in the bio. According to The Take's video and research, they explain when scandals led by men are covered by the media, they're often not blamed on the individual man, but instead are blamed on the entire company. And so the headlines of these news articles usually point at the entire company as being the criminals instead of just a single individual person, which, surprise, surprise, is not the case for scandals led by women. The women at the top of these companies are often singled out as the sole representatives of the crime rather than having the entire company be the focus of the article. Now, just to be clear, I do think it is important to blame the person who is committing the crime, and it's important to highlight their crimes and who they are. I'm not at all criticizing that, but what I am critical about is why there is such a difference in the way media covers corporate scandals between men and women. And to really highlight this, in 2016, a Wall Street Journal article said nearly 80% of digital and print media stories about companies in crisis cited the CEO as a source of blame when the company leader was a woman. That compared with 31% of stories assigning blame to male CEOs in stories about companies in similar situations. The discrepancy feels a little strange, no? And also further highlights why we as a society are so specifically interested in the crimes of a con woman than a con man. And often when there is a con man, we kind of, at least in the corporate world, we kind of attribute his failures a lot to his company as well, rather than just singling him out. So is this double standard the only reason why we're seeing so many stories about the con woman? Well, not exactly. Perhaps it is a little more layered than that. Besides the fact that all of these con artists who are so hyper-focused on right now by streaming services all happen to be women, there's another common factor between all of them. They all happen to specifically be bad women. And so that begs the question, does the mere existence of a woman as a villain make for entertaining television? Now, to break down what I mean specifically by the bad woman, let's take a look at what a bad woman often looks like. And since we are talking about media and stories, let's look at the mold that a bad woman would fit in specifically here. So that is in the villainess trope. And so what's the image that comes to your mind when you think of the word villain? Well, I was wondering this, and so I went on incognito so that my history would not be affecting my search and looked up the word villain. And when I did this, I noticed that you'll mostly see darkened images of smirking men and that there's almost no woman in the search results for this. And so that got me thinking, perhaps as a society, when we think of the word villain, we think of a bad guy. Okay. Does this mean that women have not existed as bad in TV shows? And the answer to that is absolutely not. Women have existed in modern cinema as villains quite often, but historically they seem to be more as a form of lesson or warning to other women on how they cannot deviate from the norm or what's expected of them. Are they treated as scapegoats for society's failings or cultural fears? Throwback to Salem witch trials, am I right? I love saying that like I was alive then. Or the woman as a villain is kind of treated as a seductress who tempts the man to the dark side, and as a physical manifestation for dark temptation and desire that the man has to fight against to actually become a hero. And so we do have to admit that our society's prevalence of depicting women as the sole villain isn't that common, specifically when their motivations for being a villainess is not tied to the progress of the male hero's story arc or something that society needs to be blamed for. And so often she doesn't really exist if she's not a metaphor or being punished for her sexual deviance. Or, in some cases where she's too in love with a man and so she's like his aide, and like if she's not like that then she doesn't really exist. We don't usually see the woman as a wrecking havoc or being a general menace due to her own motivations and ambition, especially when she's not being punished for having an ambition, but is instead being punished for the crimes that she committed as a result of the way she decided to go about achieving those ambitions. We especially don't really see the villainess character in stories where she isn't being used as a religious or cultural metaphor or as a character who has nothing to do with romance or sexuality. Maybe that's why the conwoman is so fascinating. Additionally, something that we also have to acknowledge is that media and TV shows arc of actually showing women as real people and not as extensions for men or as plot devices for men is a fairly new phenomena. And historically, a lot of the way Western society looked at as women was as vulnerable, not as intelligent as men, easily manipulated, and so perhaps it was shocking when women were anything but, and especially shocking when these women were bad. And so perhaps society still has remnants of those views, and so we still remain kind of shocked when we see a woman as a criminal, specifically a con woman, because she's not like other girls. No, she is a registered felon. And so perhaps it's this lack of belief in women's abilities to lie or con, or the social perception of their gender and those who are more feminine presenting as a whole that enables these con women to do exactly that, con people, because no one suspected these women to be con artists, and so they were able to flourish in this field. Well, I guess flourish is not really true since they all got caught, but they were able to succeed in this field enough to scam people. Another fascinating fact about all three of the subjects that we are talking about in this video today is that all of them are white women. Historically, due to racist rhetoric, the white woman was seen as pure, needing of protection, precious, and that if she ever committed a crime, it was simply because she'd be tempted to do that, coerced to do that, or forced by some other worse, evil external forces. Now, we're kind of looking at through the historical lens here to see why we have this biases against women that might be contributing to why we find the story of the con woman so fascinating, and also why these women were able to get away with what they did for as long as they did. When I was doing the research, I came across information about how often in cases when white women were engaged in relationships with men of color, specifically black men, the man was often imprisoned under false allegations that he had forced the woman to do so, coerced her, or done it without her consent, because it just wasn't conceivable to society at that time to think that this innocent woman could consent to this terrible man. A lot of them were even imprisoned under false accusations of doing the R word to these women. And the reason why all of this was possible is because of one, racism, but also because of this general belief that white women were just pure. According to Dr. April Williams, an assistant professor in communications and media at the University of Michigan and a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, who focuses on race, gender, and communities in digital spaces, said, "White women are positioned as the virtue of society because they hold that power as the mothers, as the keepers of virtuosity, all these ideologies that we associate with white motherhood and white women in particular." And so as white women were often historically seen as pinnacle of the purity of society and righteousness, vulnerability, and everything that needs to be protected, seeing them commit crimes and do the complete opposite is absolutely shocking to people, especially when it was this societal idea of them that allowed these women to commit these crimes. Perhaps traces of this biased belief continue to exist in our general pop culture, which is perhaps why there's so many new shows about women like this, especially when it's this very identical trait that allows these women to commit these crimes. For example, Anna Delvey, despite being an immigrant, was able to enter these spaces and scam these massive major corporations, despite not having the paperwork, any of the money that she claimed to have, or any of the legal backing that she needed to even be able to begin to do business with them. Or Elizabeth Holmes, who at 19 being a college dropout and not knowing nearly enough of biotech to be able to even begin to explain or attempt to help create this product, was able to lie to massive and major investors and so many people about the success of her product and almost get away completely with the scam she was pulling, especially when at times she had investors believe in her when she couldn't even run a product test or would even refuse to show them her working lab. And now the show, The Dropout itself, makes sure to remind us of this. is when one of the characters wonders aloud why so many business and tech leaders support her. Dr. Richard Fuse explains that it's because she's pretty and blonde. And so perhaps these investors, because of these preconceived notions, biases, and unintentional ways of thinking, trusted her because according to the way that the world had taught them to think, she was trustworthy, even though she wasn't, and there was no evidence to really explain that she was. And going along that vein, these shows show how even these big investors can fall prey to such cons. So perhaps the con woman can con us all. Also, just to be very clear, this is not a deep dive into race or the way it's played in these shows. This was just a mere mention that I think was important for me to talk about because it did contribute to a lot of their ability to get away with this, especially since all three women have been blonde at some point in time. Anna Delvey's hair changed too fast, but all three women did enjoy this privilege and used it in a way to scam other people. But if you do want to learn more about the racial aspect of these topics, there are a few links, I think one or two, that do talk about this in the bio of this video. I've linked them underneath my sources because that is mostly where I got my information from for this part of the video. Okay, so moving along. The con woman is interesting to learn about. Why aren't we learning as much about women who murder or kidnap? And why aren't we learning that much about fictional women who do so? My theory is that a relatively young genre has begun to grow even larger, and that genre is true crime. Now, according to Cambridge Dictionary, true crime is books and movies about real crime that involve real people. Most of the true crime media, literature, and podcasts that we get usually center around murder, missing persons, and the mysteries surrounding that. And they often are talking about men who have committed these things. We do get cases about women too, but they're not often about con artists or people committing white-collar crimes. And so perhaps this obsession with the con woman, specifically the real con woman that we are seeing, is just a symptom of the current nature of true crime becoming kind of oversaturated with the same kinds of stories. Because there's only a certain amount of true crime cases that can be covered, and there are so many true crime podcasts, TV shows, documentaries, and general literature. And so maybe we're seeing this genre unfold and increase to include more kinds of crimes. Maybe this genre is asking, are we talking too much about murder? Have we covered them all? Which I don't actually think that's what they're talking about. They definitely did not ask the first question. And so maybe this is just a genre growing naturally to encompass more underneath its umbrella. And not to be clear, stories about con artists are not totally uncommon. Movies like Catch Me If You Can, which star Leonardo da Vinci was not a con man, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, tells a story of a famous con man who conned people and forged documents so successfully that he almost completely got away with it. He had people believing he was a lawyer, a doctor, incredibly wealthy, but even then movies and TV shows about true con artists are not as common as we think. The most recent one I can think of that it doesn't have anything to do with Inventing Anna, The Dropout, or The Bad Vegan is A Tinder Swindler, which also tells the real story about a con man who conned women that he met on Tinder out of a lot of money. And the success of both this movie and this documentary might have shown perhaps that there is a growing interest in con artistry and stories relating to it. And so because the movies, literature, and podcasts we've gotten about these con artists have so far been specific to men, maybe that's why these streaming services decided to focus on women, because it changes the genre up, it garners interest because it's nothing like the content these services have made before. Perhaps we are just watching the natural evolution of a genre spread out a little to include even the stories and crimes of women. Now, I do want to acknowledge that in the time since I've written the script for this video and planned it out, 2 other documentaries about potential girl bosses have dropped. One of them being how the company we worked failed, and I think the show is called We Crashed. And the second one is A Girl from Plainsville, which is not about a white-collar crime because it's about a girl who convinces her boyfriend to kill himself over text. But there are aspects of her story that have similarities to the Girlbosses and their crimes, but not completely. There are just very few similarities, but I thought they were similar enough for me to mention in this video. And so because of the existence of these 2 shows, show a new trope developing in the genre itself. Maybe the true crime genre is not just evolving and growing to add stories about con women, but maybe it's beginning to tell the stories of girl bosses as a fictional subcategory in its own right. Maybe there's something deeply interesting about this girl boss and how she seems to be the modern Icarus, flying way too close to the sun, and not an eternal self-sacrificing way either. Okay, so the conclusion of this video, why? Why do we love to see the girl boss fail? And the answer? It's a lot more layered than we think. Yes, the sudden influx of all these shows about the girl boss failing could be because we're watching a genre grow. Or perhaps it could be because maybe some deeply problematic part of our brains is more harsh towards women who commit similar mistakes towards men and still fail. Or perhaps there's a new interest in seeing a different kind of villain, or there's a certain satisfaction that we all have in seeing rich people who, despite all their security and legal protections, can be made fools too. And this might be especially satisfying because we get to see such glaringly obvious evidence of the massive inequality of wealth between us, the general audience, and the rich characters being portrayed on screen, and therefore the rich people who were conned in real life. Or perhaps, in the case of girl bosses like Elizabeth Holmes, it's a little more personal because we got to see them, a woman, lead in their field and be the very first and sometimes only form of representation for us in a room. We got to see her do this, talk about feminism and why she thinks it's so important for women to fight for what they want and be ambitious and chase their dreams, only to realize that despite all of what she was saying, she is a fraud. And so her only representation in some of these male-dominated fields was a fraud, which might send a message to the entire industry that if our only representation in their field is a fraud, perhaps we women are also a fraud. Maybe it feels like they personally betrayed us because they also gave us so much expectation of what we could possibly achieve and then absolutely failed to deliver on it in the most cataclysmic way possible. And so maybe watching them fail is satisfying because it almost angers us, like, how dare you make a fool out of us when we believed in you? How dare you take advantage of our dreams, our passions to do such a thing? It's almost painful to see these women hurt a cause that they had pretended to champion so much. There's a scene in the Dropout where it almost feels like every ambitious woman who has dreamed becoming something in the very much male-dominated spaces of corporate and tech and business seems to be speaking through the character Dr. Gardner in the Dropout, who actually is a real person. When she's talking about Elizabeth Holmes being a fraud, and I will be reading the dialogue from the show, "I've supported women my whole career, and how many chances are women going to get to do what she's doing, to be the CEO of a major startup? She screws this up and we all look bad. That's the ugly truth, and that is unforgivable." And later when she's confronting Elizabeth Holmes about this, she says, "What do you think happens to all of the other women who want to start companies? Who do they go to? Who's gonna trust them? Because it's not just you. It's never just you." And she says this to highlight and truly enhance how terrible what Elizabeth Holmes is doing and how it's not just crime, but it's so much more layered than that. And it's gonna have way larger repercussions than just fraud would. So maybe we want to see the girl boss fall for all the reasons I named above. Or maybe we want to see the girl boss fail because of the unrealistic expectations she places on women about how they have to succeed and what they must do to succeed, and how incredibly non-inclusive girl boss is in the way she touts about feminism. Or perhaps the girl boss is actually a cautionary tale to women that you can dream, but remember, if you fail or falter similarly to other men, you'll be crucified in a way that those men will never experience. Personally, I do believe that if you girl boss too close to the sun, you get a TV show because of how rare it is for us to get stories of women like this, and how there recently has been a shift in both literature and media, the different ways that we are presenting women. Now, we're not just presenting them, we're going beyond the tropes, beyond the very decided character roles or the need to want to make women likable or empty characters, and we're showing that women can also be unlikable because women, believe it or not, are human beings and come in many shades. I also think this is happening because of the renewed interest in the anti-hero or villain origin story, and how usually when we see these stories, it's mostly about men, and so having this be a real woman who actually committed these crimes is in itself very fascinating because we've just never seen it before. So perhaps there's something to say about the novelty of the idea. And maybe, like I said before, it could also just be because of the media's bias in the way they cover crimes committed by men versus women. How much more media coverage a woman's crime gets with her being singled out for doing something just creates natural curiosity in us because we are seeing what's happening on the news, and so we might recognize the woman's name a little more, which makes us more curious about it when we end up seeing the same name on a streaming service. Either way, taking all of that into account, the fact remains that if you girl boss too close to the sun, you could get a TV show out of it. And that's the video. This video was kind of all over the place. I ended up not having a very conclusive ending, or I feel like some parts of it weren't as good as I wanted it to be. For some reason, I really struggled to get my thoughts down for the later half of this video. So this is the best I could do, but I hope you enjoyed the video, and it's way more cheerful than last video for sure. And I just wanted to thank everyone for supporting me so much. And if you'd like to continue to do so, feel free to like and subscribe. It's always very encouraging. And if you comment, that is also super encouraging. And I would also love to hear your thoughts on this topic, why you think these girl bosses are getting so much attention in TV shows. Did I miss something? Did I get something wrong? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. And another thing, I wanted to thank you all so much for giving me 300 subscribers. I think it's 300 and something now, but I really appreciate the support. We continue to be a little town that is growing and bustling and ready to keep exploring topics. So thank you so much for becoming part of this township. I feel like these metaphors they're getting kind of weird. I'll see you soon with a way better structured video, and I hope you have a lovely day. And you know, if there's anything to learn from this video, it is no to the negative toxic girl boss attitudes, but yes to the drive and ambition that they have, I guess. If there's any positive takeaway that we can take away. I just said takeaway twice. But yeah, see you soon. Goodbye. Having curly hair is great, because in person, my hair, great time, but on camera, she looks kind of like a mop. Girl, what is this? Why aren't you curling correctly for the camera?